Chapter 14, Part 2. So this image here shows a homunculus. Homunculus in Latin means little man. So this image, if you've ever taken, I think, psychology, you've probably seen this before. And basically what it's showing is where the most sensory neurons, kind of to scale, are found. So in the body, okay, this dude, in the lips, it's showing they're really big in comparison to, say, the back. All right, so the back doesn't have, in comparison, per square inch or whatever, the lips have a lot of sensory neurons compared to the back, the skin of the back. And where that information goes is specific parts of the brain. So this would be the back of the brain, and this would be the front of the brain. So the sensory information coming in for the genitals, the toes, the foot, the leg, the hip, and so on come in the front part of, well, the front part of the somatosensory cortex. And then things like the tongue and the pharynx, those come in towards the back part of this area of the brain. So the size of the homunculus parts are meant to be to scale to the number of sensory neurons in that area. So this picture gives kind of an indication of, in this particular case, the sensory distribution along the cerebral cortex of the brain. And we'll do this related to motor here in a couple slides as well. So control of skeletal muscles. The motor system maintains posture and balance, moves the limbs, trunk, head, eyes, facial expression, and speech. Our reflexes are involved in involuntary movements that occur without conscious thought. Our voluntary movements are consciously activated to achieve a specific goal. So our motor system is controlled through a couple different ways, whether it be reflexes, which are involuntary, and then of course skeletal movements, which are voluntary. So there's 3 steps in voluntary movements. I'm not going to necessarily ask you the steps exactly, but this is kind of like review of what we've already talked about. The initiation of most voluntary movements begins with the premotor areas of the cerebral cortex and result in the stimulation of the upper motor neurons. The axons of the upper motor neurons form the descending nerve tracts. They stimulate lower motor neurons, which stimulate skeletal muscles to contract. And then the cerebral cortex interacts with the basal nuclei and the cerebellum in the planning, coordination, and execution of those movements. So the motor areas of the cerebral cortex include the primary motor cortex, which is also known as the primary motor area, and this controls many voluntary movements, especially fine motor movements of the hands. We have the premotor area, which controls motor functions organized before initiation, which is basically the staging area before the actual movement. And then the prefrontal area is motivation, foresight, to plan and initiate movements, and as well as emotional behavior and mood. So this is the spatial organization of the primary motor cortex. So when you compare this picture to the other picture, you'll notice that there are some differences. But you can compare them on your own if you want. You're not going to have to label this or anything. It's just kind of giving you some more information based on what we're talking about here. Modifying and refining motor activities. The basal nuclei and the cerebellum help to control that. The basal nuclei are that part of the brain is important in planning, organizing, and coordinating movements and posture. And the cerebellum helps to maintain muscle tone and postural muscles, helps to control balance during movement, and coordinate our eye movements as well. The brainstem functions, so we have ascending and descending pathways that pass through the brainstem. Many reflexes important to survival are located here, like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, sleeping, swallowing, vomiting, coughing, and sneezing. The RAS, the reticular activating system, helps to control the sleep-wake cycle. Basically, it receives input from the cranial nerves, optic nerves, vestibulocochlear nerves, ascending tactile sensory pathways, descending neurons from the cerebral cortex. Wakefulness is maintained by information coming in from the eyes and the ears, and because of information coming in from the cerebral cortex. Some higher brain functions include speech. This area is normally in the left cerebral cortex. So we have two specific areas that I may ask you about, the Wernicke area and the Broca area. The Wernicke area is the speech, the sensory speech, understanding what is heard and thinking of what one will say. The Broca area is the motor speech area. So that's the action of speaking. So Wernicke is basically understanding speech and thinking of what to say. And Broca is the act of speaking. So, well, I'm not going to get into this. You can read over that. I'm just going to keep moving here. This is just what the brain looks like during speech. It's just, I left that in there because it's interesting. So communication between the right and left hemispheres. So we refer to the term lateralization, and that's when that means basically functions are performed by distinct regions of the brain. So certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain things, not the entire brain, and not equal on both sides. So there's different areas of the brain that are responsible for controlling language, formulating memories, and making movements. And they're all different areas. The right side of the brain controls muscular activity in and receives sensory information from the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls muscular activities in and receives sensory information from the right side of the body. So, we talked about how, I mentioned this, I think, when I covered the brain, how there's a brain, how there's kind of a crossing over as stuff is coming into the brain. It's going from one side to the other, one side of the body to the opposite side of the brain. So sensory information of both hemispheres are shared through commissures, known as the corpus callosum. And I did mention that the corpus callosum is what actually joins the brain together, that the hemispheres are not physically attached to each other, that those are separate, and that they are, the two sides of the brain are attached through basically the corpus callosum as well as the brainstem. Language and possibly other functions like artistic activities are not shared equally. You may have heard about this before, that you might be very left-brained if you're really good in math, and maybe you can speak many different languages. The right side of the brain is more makes people more three-dimensional or spatially have a better perception of space, recognition of faces, and have some musical ability. So, people that maybe are good or super artistic, and, can play the piano without even thinking about it, but are also really good in math, you don't always hear that. You're either, generally speaking, you're a super artistic person, or you're a super I'm having a loss for words today, but anyway, you might be good in math, but you're not necessarily good in music. Now, there are exceptions to the rule all the time. So just because that's mentioned doesn't mean it's absolute fact for everyone. There are many people out there that are super artistic and, are, rocket scientists probably. So, all right. So, brain waves in sleep. So I just included this because it's got some really cool information in it. So the electroencephalogram, the EEG, is a record of the brain's activity. It's a summation of all the action potentials occurring at a particular moment, sensed by electrodes placed on the scalp. We have a couple of different brainwave patterns included here: alpha, beta, theta, and delta. Our sleep cyclic patterns of NREM and REM sleep. You can see here what our brain is doing during sleep, and where we are in each stage. Again, there might be a question or two on the quiz or the test on this, but I'm not going to jump up and down about sleep patterns. Memory, working memory, and I'm not going to read through everything on this slide because it's pretty straightforward. It's just know the different types of memories: working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, declarative memory, and procedural memory. Again, flashcards would be great for this. Pretty straightforward, different types of memory here. And then the last part of this chapter is on the limbic system. I keep it very short and sweet on this. The limbic system is closely associated with emotions. If you remember nothing else about the limbic system, please remember that it is associated with emotions. It influences our responses to emotions, our motivation, our mood, our sensations of pain and pleasure. The limbic system is associated with our basic survival instincts, our acquisition of food and water, and reproduction. Pheromones are molecules released by one organism that have an effect on another organism. For example, females released pheromones that affect menstrual cycles in other women. The cingulate gyrus is our satisfaction center, and the hippocampus is a connection to the limbic system that is important to survival. So again, a lot of this chapter is just basically knowing the terms and what they mean, especially when we get up into the sensory receptors. So that's it for chapter 14.